Hi, everybody. Welcome to the BC Wheelchair Sports Show. I'm really excited to announce a new project that we are launching with today's episode. 2021 is the 50th anniversary of the BC Wheelchair Sports Association. And to commemorate that, we are bringing you a series of interviews and episodes with key figures from BC Wheelchair Sports' 50 years. And we're discussing the key moments and exciting stories that you might not have heard and shining a light on the incredible individuals who have contributed to make BC Wheelchair Sports what it is today. I'm very fortunate today to be joined by Kathy Newman and Laurel Crosby for our first episode. Kathy Newman is a member of the BC Sports Hall of Fame. She's our former executive director. Laurel Crosby is the current president of BC Wheelchair Sports and Wheelchair Rugby Canada. So they're both incredible people with extensive experience in the parasport world who have contributed so much to wheelchair sports, not only in BC, but in Canada and around the globe. How are you guys doing today?
We're great, thanks.
Great, thanks, Nathan.
No worries. So to get things started, I just wanted to ask you, because you guys are really some of the drivers behind this project along with myself, why is it important to commemorate the history of BC wheelchair sports and to share the history of parasport?
Well, I think it's important to not lose the rich history of the organization. And my experience has been over the years that when we, I guess, have to say goodbye to people or we lose people in the organization, we lose so much information. So this is a valuable initiative because hopefully we'll capture some of those stories that make the organization the great organization that it is.
And I would agree with that. I mean, there's just so many amazing individuals over the years that we've been involved. And so being able to acknowledge them and recognize them and tell their stories is great, as well as looking at the evolution of BC wheelchair sports and sport itself. So this is a great opportunity to highlight this.
Yeah. And what are you hoping that the public learns from this project?
I think that that I hope they learn how innovative wheelchair sports has been over the years, how progressive we have been, how thoughtful, how successful we've been.
Nice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal when you look back over the 50 years and you look at some of the sports teams, the equipment, you know, the level of athletic ability, and just see how incredibly far we have come. And I think that's what we want the public to see.
Yeah.
I think people see BC wheelchair sports and athletes and things like that in the now, but they don't always recognize where we've come from. So I think that's really important.
And so to building on that comment too, is some of our current athletes are not familiar with what it was like 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So to be able to educate them on how far things have developed, I think is extremely valuable as well.
Yeah, and I think that's something I'm really excited about too, is because we're at a really exciting time for parasport in this country, where we're finally starting to get, you know, the attention and the profile that people have been clamoring for years. And I think it'll be great to in that time where there is a spotlight on it, to actually be able to go back and show that, you know, share those stories that might not have been given their due during their time. And I think that's really important as well. Now, for our next question, it's more about the two of you, because on all of the episodes of the BC Wheelchair Sports Show, we always ask our guests how they first got involved in wheelchair sports. So can you tell me how you first discovered wheelchair or parasport, and what made you decide to get involved with them? And we'll start with Kathy.
Well, I think, Nathan, we should start with Laurel, because Laurel has had a longer history than I have. And it was through Laurel's involvement in wheelchair sports that I got involved. So I'm gonna suggest that we reverse that start to this question.
All right, that sounds good. We'll pass the mic to Laurel.
Okay. So it's kind of interesting because we've been having these conversations, and sometimes you really have to think back in terms of your timelines. And so when I thought about becoming involved in sport or involving myself with athletes with a disability, it's actually been 50 years since I started at GF Strong Rehab Center.
Wow.
So yeah, so I started in 1971. So I started in the recreation department there, at first as a volunteer and then a part-time staff member while I went to university. And while I went to university, I was getting a degree in physical education. So while I loved what I was doing with GF Strong, I was more interested in the sport aspect. So I went to BC Wheelchair Sports and asked if they needed any volunteers. And of course, they grabbed me and pulled me in. So I started out actually as a track coach with BC Wheelchair Sports, and then was very quickly recruited to the board of directors. So I sat on the board of directors for, well, I've been on the board for over 40 years. So that's interesting. So I've done lots of different things. I know that you have lots of other questions, and a lot of the things that I've done will come up in those questions. But what is interesting is that as part of my role as a track coach, and then I actually became the track and field commissioner, I was responsible for making sure that our athletes had an opportunity to compete and get into track meets. So our athletes went to a Langley track meet, and there I met Kathy Newman. And so that was
Nice.
So from my
I think that's
perspective,
a good segue into Kathy.
yeah. So what happened was in 1981, I was the president of the Langley Mustangs Track and Field Club. That was also the International Year for Disabled Persons. And our track club hosted an annual track meet called the Pacific Invitational. And we decided to celebrate the International Year of the Disabled and invited wheelchair athletes to our track meet. And I must admit, and Laurel, you may have some insight into this, but I have a feeling that our track meet was maybe one of the first track meets in BC for sure, or if not Canada, that invited wheelchair athletes to participate alongside the able-bodied athletes. So I think that was kind of historic. Anyway, so I reached out to BC Wheelchair Sports and obviously got connected to Laurel as the track commissioner and coach. And that's when we started to communicate. And then when the track meet was over, it was a huge success. And BC Wheelchair Sports was looking for some new staff people. And I don't know, Laurel, if you asked me if I was interested, I think you might
did.
have.
Yeah. In fact, I think I probably did when we were at the track meet. Because sitting on the board, I was involved with the staff and all that kind of stuff. So we had an executive director, but we had a gap in the administrative area.
Right.
And so we had a vacancy for a job. And after working with you for the track meet and all that kind of stuff, I thought, oh, Kathy would be the perfect person for BC Wheelchair Sports.
And so we haven't looked back for the past 40 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And how would you say, I guess, over the course of those 40 years that your personal and professional relationship has developed? Because obviously you've worked together on a number of projects, not only with BC Wheelchair Sports, but with a number of the national sporting organizations in the country. So what's that been like to kind of grow and work together for all those years?
You know, I was thinking about this question, and you know, I think that what's intriguing about mine and Laurel's relationship is that the way I'm going to describe it is we're in sync. We're on the same page, and she and I have spent over 40 years collaborating, bouncing ideas off of each other, challenging each other when it comes to difficult situations, supporting each other. We've seen our personal lives, families grow, you know, just been very, very supportive of one another. And I don't think you get that kind of relationship that often with somebody, and I really value our relationship on a personal level and also on a, sort of work level, so to speak.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And you're right. I think it's not often that you find someone that you are just so in sync with, and you develop this relationship over time that is just such a valuable and important part of your life. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, John said to me, "Hey, you haven't talked to Kathy this week. Is everything okay?" So, we're just, it's great to have someone that you can always touch base with. You can always, if you need advice, if you need to flesh out an idea or something that you want to do, you always have somebody who's there. And as Kathy said, you can have lots of great relationships, but you're not always in sync with the other person. And we feel like we totally are.
Yeah.
Nice. I feel like that's definitely been a real big positive, for BC wheelchair sports and for the parasport movement in BC and across the country. Now moving on from the personal question, we'll go a bit into things about your careers and some of the work that you've done with BC wheelchair sports. So I know that one of the things that Kathy and Laurel, that you're both really big advocates and supporters of, and that during your times you really pushed and are still very active in supporting today, is the importance of event hosting and turning BC into a real destination for a number of larger parasport and wheelchair sport events over the years. Can you just talk to me a little bit about your views on event hosting, why you think it's important, and then what some of your favorite events have been over the years?
I know that Laurel and I were talking about this the other day, and it's kind of funny because I do believe wholeheartedly in event hosting. I think there's so many benefits that come from it that I'll talk about in a minute. But I was always looking for a chairperson for the different events that we would host, and I don't know, my head would just swivel to Laurel to say, "Do you want to be the chair of this event?" And so we worked on a lot of events together. And the very start of it was in 1982. We hosted the BC Games for the Physically Disabled in Langley, in my hometown. And I asked Laurel then to be the chair of the organizing committee. And that was the start of it. And my experience has been that when you host events, there's so many benefits to an organization for hosting that go beyond the obvious, the competitive opportunities for the athletes, but the ability to build relationships, build partnerships, access funding sources that you might not have been able to access before, put a spotlight on parasport and the athletes, be able to tell their stories, share in their successes, and it's just endless. So Laurel, you have a long history of being chairperson of many events over the years, for sure.
And I've loved it. I mean, I just it's so exciting to me to chair these events and work our way through to incredible success with them. For me as well, awareness is a huge part of these events, aside from all the other things that Kathy talked about. But I was really fortunate being in the school system as a teacher and then a school administrator to get the school kids involved. So we did a lot of different things to be able to promote that kind of awareness within the school system and with kids. And there's so many great stories about, the kids who, just are so excited to have athletes come in and talk to them, and then to be able to go to the event and see them compete. And the awareness within our school district was amazing due to the opportunities that we brought for them.
And obviously,
I just want to add too, Kathy talked about, the big event. Actually, the first event that stands out in my mind that I absolutely loved was our first junior sport camp at Ray Sheward's house. So I have to tell this story, and I know, Nathan, that you're going to do junior sport and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not sure, apart from Kathy and I, whether other people sort of have this story. So we wanted to get our juniors involved in a sport camp, and Ray Sheward, who was a member of the Lions Club, offered his house in Surrey to host a junior sport camp. So this was a great, huge house. It had a big, long driveway. It had a pond in the back that was stocked with fish. And so this was our opportunity to get the kids out and get them involved. So we gathered up our kids, we headed out to the junior sport camp, and the kids were great. We did relays up and down the driveway, we did obstacle courses, the kids had an opportunity to fish in the pond. And Ray and his club and all the volunteers were just fantastic. And it always stands out in my mind as kind of one of the beginnings, and I just loved that.
So building on what Laurel said, that was the start of our attention to getting children involved in wheelchair sport. So Laurel's being a bit modest here, because at the end of the day, it was through her leadership that the National Junior Sport Fest actually was hosted. I'm going to say back in the 80s, late 80s sometime, and kids came from across Canada, and we housed them at Richmond High School, and we did a ton of different sporting activities for a week-long event. And then the camp was hosted in other parts of Canada, and that was a sort of the start of making sure that we included children in our sport programming opportunities. And we continue to this day to have junior sport camps.
Yeah, so obviously that really built a very strong legacy, because junior programming is such a core tenet of what we do now, and it's such an important thing too. You know, we're seeing like things like that. The Let's Play program is really big now, launched by BC Wheelchair Basketball, that we're a part of as well in some capacity, where kids are getting involved even earlier than before. Obviously, Junior Sport Camp is one of our big things that we run every summer. I'm an alumni of Junior Sport Camp. I think that was one of my first introductions to the world of wheelchair sports. And I also think, kind of tying into Laurel's point, you know, on the schools program, is it's really important to get that awareness of people with disabilities and wheelchair sports to people at an early age, because that helps spread, you know, knowledge about what exists, and also helps create a broader spirit of inclusion, which is something that I think is very important to definitely the three of us and a lot of people within our community. So it's really cool to see how different pieces over time kind of come together and build into what things are today. So thank you. I was unaware of that story, so that was a cool new story for me. I actually don't know. I feel like starting in a mansion and then ending up as a rec center, it's almost like we went backwards in a way.
Yeah. I don't know, Nathan, if you're going to ask the question a little bit later, but I did want to talk about the 2010 games and just the opportunity for, you know, talk about hosting events. That was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Great experience. Kathy and Gail did such a great job, and as chair, I loved all aspects of it. But for me, one of the most valuable parts of it was the schools program in that. So it was the development of the wheelchair rugby schools manual that I put together in conjunction with some colleagues, but also the opportunity for so many children across the Lower Mainland to be able to come to those games and to be able to observe wheelchair rugby games, but also to observe them knowledgeably. So with the manual that we put together and promoted and, you know, worked on in conjunction with demos with the athletes, it was such a phenomenal program. And, you know, I think the fact that we were able to involve so many kids in that was amazing.
Yeah. And just for anyone who might be listening who doesn't know, when Laurel mentioned the 2010 games, she wasn't referring to the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. She was referring to the 2010 World Wheelchair Rugby Championships, which BC Wheelchair Sports and Wheelchair Rugby Canada hosted at the Richmond Olympic Oval in 2010, and that we'll have a whole episode on later this year at some point, because it's definitely one of the the really key events that we put on in the past 50 years. So just wanted to put in that point of information there. But yeah, great event, and definitely looking forward to getting into that in more depth. Going forward to our next question, obviously you've mentioned a lot of really positive developments, things that have been great, things that have been fantastic for all of you. But I think a key thing that Kathy mentioned kind of in her introduction when talking about why this is important is letting people know how things were 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think a key element of that is what sort of challenges you guys encountered in trying to develop wheelchair sports and get other people to buy into the events that you're hosting. So can you talk to me a little bit about what sort of challenges parasport faced when you guys were first starting out in the 70s and 80s?
I think one of the biggest challenges when I sort of took on the leadership role of the organization was around funding and trying to ensure that BC Wheelchair Sports, or even broader than BC Wheelchair Sports, but sports for athletes with disabilities were given equal funding. So I was constantly trying to convey our issues that we had with the funding policies and trying to influence change. And I think I was successful in doing that because at the end of the day, BC Wheelchair Sports enjoys a significant amount of funding from the various government levels. So I'm proud of the work that we did there. The other thing that I think was important was around awareness and just constantly conveying that message. And one of the ways I describe it is we often hear people talk about the Olympics, and I want to see the day where the world says the Olympics and Paralympics in one sentence. So we would constantly see images of athletes that didn't include wheelchair sport athletes. We'd constantly hear stories from the media, you name it, and even sort of to have representation on official communications. So make sure that when people put together, glossy brochures like they did back in the day, that there was, representation from a wheelchair athlete on those official brochures, so to speak. So I don't know, Laurel, if you've got anything else to add to that.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the evolution in terms of awareness has been huge. And, I look back to the years that I worked at GF Strong Rehab Center, and as part of the recreational program, we would go to restaurants and out to shopping malls and things like that. And at that time, we were such an oddity. Like, people would stare at us as we were going through the mall with someone in a wheelchair. And if we went out to dinner somewhere, it was just huge in terms of accessibility. Where there's stairs in the restaurant, would we be able to get in? And when I look at that evolution over time, it's been tremendous. And I think that, one of the great things that we've seen is that wheelchair athletes are seen as athletes first. People recognize the athletic ability and look beyond the disability. And I think that is extremely positive. But, I would agree with Kathy. I mean, funding is a huge part of it, just in terms of funding the organization, the ability to run programs, the ability to get equipment that is, allows athletes to compete at a higher level. And those are some of the issues that I think that we've worked on over the years.
Yeah. And are there any, obviously, because you guys are still very involved in the world, are there any challenges or issues that you saw, back early in your career that you think still persist today? And if there are, do you have any recommendations or advice for the people who are still working, on the ground and working on things like wheelchair sports programs or trying to host events?
Well, I think in BC we have come a long way, and I think because of the work that we have done um, in building relationships and conveying messages to key funding partners and influencers, I think that we're in a fairly good position. But where I see a lot of inequity is in other parts of Canada. And so I think that we need to be mindful of that and be careful in our communication, be thoughtful in our in the way we present our messaging, and try to influence change where we can, and get understanding. I know that one example of a policy I was able to influence was around gaming. And back in the day when they were just developing the, how you get funding from casinos and bingos and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. They had policies that were not really reflective of the challenges that sport for athletes with disability face. And so through different communications and conversations, I was able to influence the policy at the gaming branch to include athletes with disabilities in the youth category, not the adult category that was more restrictive, because providing sport opportunities for people with disabilities was more expensive. Like Laurel mentioned, the access to equipment and all that kind of stuff. So that, I guess that's what I'm trying to say is I think we've come a long way in BC, but I see a big challenge in other parts of Canada.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As president of Wheelchair Rugby Canada, there are some provinces that are not even represented at the national level because they don't have any provincial organization or organized opportunities for athletes. So I think that that's a big part of it. It's interesting for me too, just in terms of evolution, and we look at the evolution of sport, also to look at the evolution of coaches and managers and those kinds of individuals over time. And I do have an interesting story about my first start in management. So when I was in BC Wheelchair Sports, I had lots of opportunities to manage teams and chair games and things like that.
Yeah.
At that time, there was the process of the national organization for the Canadian Wheelchair Sports Association was that every province would have a governor that would go and represent their province at the meetings. And so that was a huge insight for me. I loved doing it. It was great. It gave me an opportunity to see other avenues that were available for both our province and for individuals, volunteers who wanted to get involved in a national level. So I was really interested in managing at a national level. And so indicated that I was interested in one of the games. And it was actually in 1984, I was named assistant team manager of the wheelchair team. And so that was great. I was very excited by that. About 6 months before the games, somebody phoned me up and said, we've had some huge funding issues. And so, there'll be no ability for you to go. There just isn't a position for you. So I thought, okay, well, that's the way things go.
Sorry, Laurel, so was this for the 1984 Paralympic Games in New York?
Yes. Yeah. So I did not go to the games. And then when I went back to the national meeting, I discovered that someone had actually gone in my place. So I was removed and someone had gone in my place. And so it was then I discovered that there was kind of a little bit of an old boys network at the national level. And so I was absolutely determined that this was not going to happen again. And so fought very strongly to have a process for people who wanted to get involved at the national level in any position, whether it was a team manager, chef de mission, those kinds of things. And so I'm proud to say that, I really pushed for that. And we now have the ability to have a process that is fair and equitable for everybody.
Great. And I find it interesting that you mentioned kind of an old boys network at some point in time, because you're both women in sport who've occupied leadership roles for a very long time, including at a time where there wasn't a lot of women, in leadership roles in sport. And you were doing it in sports for the disabled, which were, again, fighting against all sorts of challenges and issues and lack of awareness, lack of respect. So what was that experience, like for the two of you to kind of assert your leadership and the right to respect? And from that, do you have any advice for today's leaders?
I think when one might say we were tenacious in our approach to providing leadership. I think you don't give up. I mean, you keep conveying the message. You do it thoughtfully. You do it strategically. Leadership is another issue across the wheelchair sport community, and finding that champion in the community who's prepared to, support programming and opportunities is key. So I don't know. I just give her at the end of the day.
Well, I think tenacious is a really good word, because I think we're both very tenacious. But I think we've been very fortunate over the years to have each other to sort of bounce ideas off of, and help to move organizations ahead, help to provide opportunities for us to move ahead.
And just making sure the right systems are in place, right, Laurel, to make decisions fair and equitable, and choose the right people to make things happen.
Yeah, and to always make sure that you're acting in a professional manner. Whether it's dealing with staff and dealing with other organizations, dealing with the government. That kind of thing brings a lot of respect to the organization, and I think that's really important.
And going off of that, I mean, obviously those are great examples of advice and things that you've done to set a strong example and to build a legacy from that. And part of both of your legacies is the amount of mentorship that you've been able to provide to emerging leaders within our community, including a number of our current staff members, our current executive director. So can you just talk to me a little bit about what you view the role of mentorship as in your careers and in the broader wheelchair sports world?
I think it's our responsibility. I take that responsibility very seriously, and feel that I have had the pleasure of being involved in BC wheelchair sports for over 40 years now. And if I have learned anything along this journey, it is to make sure that I share my knowledge, that I engage with other, with new people in the system, and support them and encourage them to continue to make a difference in what they're doing. I just think it's critical to who we are and what we do. And Laurel, I think is the same way.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that it's, it is our responsibility. And, a lot of it, I think, is also empowerment. We're empowering. I think it's really important. I don't think the two of us ever sort of hold on to something saying, this is mine. And, I want to, we have to do it my way. You're empowering people to think outside the box, to give them responsibilities, to learn from it. And I think that's a really important part of our role.
Well, I really appreciate, all that you've done to kind of, or not kind of, to build, our organization into what it is today, and to give people opportunities and to share that knowledge down. your incredible resources, and even with this project, you've already helped put me in touch with a number of people who I think will make this a really exciting feature moving forward. So thank you for that, and thanks for all that you've done. Moving back to sport for a minute, how have you seen the sports themselves and the athletes evolve throughout your careers? And that's a big question, I know, so.
We have to unpack that one. Two things stand out for me, and Laurel, you can build on what I'm going to say here, but one is the equipment and the evolution of the equipment. Laurel's already referenced that, but I can remember in the 80s that was the start of the introduction of the rigid chair. So prior to that, it was more the E&J type hospital chair that was used, and the athletes would come in and take the foot plates off, the armrests off, you name it. They would adapt the chair to be able to participate in the practice. So the chair has evolved massively, and then the second thing is what the heck was I going to say now? I've drawn a blank here. Laurel, you carry on.
Okay, for me, I would definitely technology and wheelchairs and equipment and things like that, but also in the areas of training, which is fascinating to me, that we have evolved and come so far in training methods. I remember working with training Daniel Wesley in track years right at the beginning. And he was always a real think outside the box kind of guy in terms of his training. So we could work on some basic strategies for the chair, but he was one of the first people, I think, to really think about the advantages of mental training in sport. And so he and I took a transcendental meditation class together so that, we could both experience it. And, he found meditation to be incredible. That was one of the really good things that he did. He also did some really random things like, drinking a can of Coke right at the start line before he left to see if that made a difference in his performance. And, he had all sorts of interesting kinds of things, but he was an outside the box thinker in terms of, I'm not just going to get out there and do what I've always done. Like, what can I do and how can I help to make it better? Yeah. And I think we've seen that evolution over the years in terms of training techniques and, the acknowledging how important mental training is and nutrition and all those other kinds of things. So it's been interesting.
I think that there's been many people in BC that have thought outside the box. And I can remember back in the early 80s, Rick Hansen was the same as Daniel, always trying to look at ways to improve performance. And I seem to remember he went back to Ottawa and took his racing chair in a wind tunnel to test aerodynamics or something like that, and came back with some innovative changes. The one thing that I was going to say too that I had lost my train of thought on was the fact that back in the early days, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, athletes would participate in everything. Mm-hmm. So if you were, for example, you signed up to participate in the BC Games for the physically disabled, you could potentially be in about 6 or 7 different sports. And so, I'm talking archery,
you're swimming, you're racing,
track, you name it. Yeah, it was extraordinary, and that was a very common thing. So the other piece that's been very interesting is while people do dabble in lots of different activities because they just enjoy physical activity, they are very sport specific in their when they want to move forward with a specific sport. And they have to be nowadays. You have to be very, targeted in what you do.
I would agree with that. And I mean, it's interesting, to see it both at the provincial level, but the first Paralympic games that I actually attended was in Seoul, Korea. And even in Korea at that time, we had athletes from Canada who competed in more than one sport.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, and as Kathy mentioned, there's just no possibility of doing that anymore. And it just doesn't make any sense.
And it's interesting because just as you mentioned, kind of professionalism, for the two of you, when advocating for wheelchair sports, in the boardroom, it's also kind of seeped over into the athletic arena where it's high performance wheelchair sports are so much more professionalized now than they used to be. Similar to like Laurel was saying with the training, nowadays, if you're a high performance wheelchair sports athlete, you probably have a large team behind you of sports scientists, personal trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, the whole thing. So it's really cool to kind of see that evolution and also see how, in my mind, the conventional, I guess, able-bodied sport world is starting to accept parasport more. And that's something that's really important to me. And I know it's really important to the two of you as well. So it's been great to see that evolution. And talking about evolution, where would you like to see BC wheelchair sports in the next 10 to 20 years?
Oh boy. I would like to see it a thriving organization around the province with as many people as possible actively engaged. So more clubs, more athletes, more leadership. Just continue going down the path it's going and be targeted in its approach to be inclusive and get people active.
I'm not sure that I could add anything more to that. I totally agree.
Yeah.
It's, I enjoy seeing the fact that there are so many more clubs that are starting up around the province. And I think that it's really, really important to continue that and to be able to provide opportunities for any athlete who wants to compete in, in whatever sport that they would like to do.
Yeah. And I guess beyond that as well, in terms of what you'd like to see going forward, what are some challenges that you see facing wheelchair sports today, or that you can anticipate possibly popping up in the future that you think people should be aware of and that they should be taking note of as we move forward?
I guess from my perspective, it's that continued understanding that in the wheelchair sport community, in order to get people involved in the organization or in physical activity, it's the need to understand that people need to be supported in the process, and that it can be, as I often say, one person at a time. And that's not a bad thing. It's just what it is at the end of the day. And so we need to recognize the resources that it takes to get people involved. And so it's having the understanding of what those resources are, and then making sure that we have the ability to provide those resources.
And I think not only for athletes, but also for volunteers as well. So I think that we need to be very conscious of the fact that we're always, recruiting people and doing a really good job in not only recruiting, but retaining volunteers, so that we have people that are in our organization that are knowledgeable, have expertise, and really want to stay in our organization. And I think that's with every organization. But I think we have to always be conscious of that.
And now I have two final questions before my list of questions for the both of you is finished for today, at least. We may have to revisit some things in more depth at a later date, which I'm sure you'll be more than happy to do. But my next question is, if you could go back in time and meet um, the version of yourself that was at the first wheelchair sports event you attended, what would you tell them knowing what you know now?
Oh boy.
It's a fun one, but it's also a deep one.
Oh,
You want me to jump in?
yeah.
It's a great question. I love this question. I had a couple of things. First of all, I would tell myself that, wow, you have such an exciting opportunities ahead of you, and to enjoy all of them. The one thing that I regret that I never did, and would have loved to have told the young me, to always keep a journal. So I'm pretty, I keep a journal of all of my travels and everything that I do now. But, when Kathy and I have conversations and we start to talk about, hey, do you remember this? Do you remember that? I would love to have had a journal for the very beginning of when I started, that recorded everything that I did and event that I was involved in. So
That's a cool idea, Laurel. I hear what you're saying, because as we age in this organization, we are often asked, about the history of the organization. So I guess for me, one of the things that I would think back on was how very fortunate I was to be involved in BC wheelchair sports, and to be grateful for the opportunity, and to do the very best I could to improve programming opportunities, improve the system, and to be thoughtful.
yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if it leads into another question, but in terms of why you do this, and I'm not sure from the very first event that we were on that I knew that I would be involved in this for over 40 years, but I can't imagine my life without it. Kathy and I always talk about the fact that we just can't imagine life without wheelchair sports in some way or another, or in some organization or another. And it just brings such a richness to my life. And I certainly appreciate all the opportunities that I've had with BC Wheelchair Sports and other organizations.
Well, Laurel, you did kind of read my mind in a way, because my next question was going to be, what has kept both of you involved for so long? Because you've been involved throughout your careers for the past 40 years. You're both retired now, but you're still actively taking on roles within the community, and you're still very involved in an advisory capacity, constantly providing different people and different organizations with advice when they ask for it. So what is it that has kept you connected to this world for so long? And I think what interests me especially too is that for both of you, like, you're not individuals with disabilities. You weren't athletes, who were involved. And so what made you want to stick around for as long as you have and continue to do so?
I think for me, it goes back to a bit back to that mentorship question you asked earlier, Nathan, and the whole idea that I have been given so many amazing opportunities that it's my responsibility to continue to give where I can back to the organization. And Laurel and I often talk about it. It's very weird. It's kind of like in our DNA kind of feeling. And I often say to my husband, because he's always saying, why do you do this kind of thing? And I say, I can't imagine not doing it. If I can't, I'm sure there'll come a day where I will say, okay, enough, but not it's not happening yet. And so if I have something to offer the organization to help advance it, then I will continue to do that. I love the challenge. Well, I mean, come on, who wouldn't love this? You're working in sport? Like, come on, like, it doesn't get any better than that.
It's a passion for what we do, and for me it's also the ability to make a difference. So, we have opportunities, we have experience, we can make a difference, with people that we work with athletes that we work with, at boards that we work with policies, all those kinds of things. But we also have the opportunity to change minds and to promote awareness. Like for me, it was a lot with school children, but also with my family. My kids were born into the wheelchair sport world, and just accepted it as what we do. And yes, we all go and volunteer and we all get involved in things, and I value that opportunity, and the fact that I think that it has made my children more thoughtful, empathetic, caring individuals.
Nice. All right, I have one final question, and then we have to wrap things up for today. But that question is, what is the biggest lesson that you've learned by being involved in wheelchair sports? And I apologize because I didn't prep you guys on that question before, but it kind of popped up as we were having these past few questions, and it's something that I'm really curious about, and that I think our listeners and our viewers will be curious about too.
I think for me, it's the importance of being a critical thinker and to be solutions driven. And I've always sort of welcomed a challenge or a problem that needs to be solved, and feel that you need to have an open mind. And as Laurel mentioned in earlier conversations, think outside the box and be solutions oriented.
All of those lessons for me that I've learned over the years with BC Wheelchair Sports and national organizations are all of those things. Thinking outside the box, accepting challenges, being a critical thinker, all of those kinds of things. And I always remember going to apply for my first administrative position and talking in an interview about all of the skills that they demanded for that administrative position that I'd actually learned from BC Wheelchair Sports and other national organizations, because, having the opportunity to coach and manage teams and be on a board and doing all those kinds of things gave me skills and opportunities that I would never have had the ability to learn anywhere else, from books or school or anything. And so I value that so much.
Awesome. All right, well, that wraps up all of my questions for today. I'm sure we'll have one or the both of you on for a couple other episodes when we go in depth on a few specific events or a few topics that you've referenced throughout this interview. I just really thought it was important to start things off, with the two of you, as two of the people who are really helping me push this project forward, and two people who have made such significant contributions to BC Wheelchair Sports and really the broader parasport world. So thank you so much for all that you've done. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed the interview. I definitely enjoyed myself. Yeah,
well,
I really appreciate it.
Nathan, thank you for all the work that you're doing and making sure that we capture the rich history of BC Wheelchair Sports. So Laurel and I really appreciate that, right, Laurel?
Absolutely. Yeah, we really do.
Brilliant. Good job, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you.